Hey there, Facebook and online world. This week's Thursday Thoughts, we're actually going to have Professor Colin Toffelmire chat with us today. He's going to be preaching this coming Sunday, and he's got some words to share about sermon topic and scripture and where God is leading him. So hand it over to you, Colin, and enjoy.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Hey, everybody. Tim is being really generous when he says that I have thoughts to share. I have a page of discombobulated notes that I'm going to eventually build into a sermon. By eventually, I mean in the next day and a half. So I'm just gonna want to walk through some of the things I'll talk about here are going to be in the sermon. Some of them are actually, this is going to be sort of like outtakes a little bit from the sermon too, because I did some work that is just not going to make it in. And so what I want to do is I want to walk through, we're talking about Genesis chapter 22 this week in church. That's the text I'm preaching from. And Genesis 22, which is called the sacrifice of Isaac by some people. The traditional Hebrew name for it is the Akedah, which is a word that means binding in Hebrew. The binding of Isaac is the traditional name for this passage. One of the most famous passages in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis. Even I think we could say it's one of the most infamous passages in the Bible because it is a really troubling passage for a lot of people for what I think are pretty obvious reasons. But I probably will talk about that at least a little bit on Sunday. But it's also one of the things that it's a little bit difficult to see when we read this passage in our English Bibles. It's a beautiful story, or it's a well-told story, at least in our English Bibles. But it's a very well-told story when you read it in Hebrew. And so I actually want to walk through just sort of, I want to kind of work a little bit verse by verse through interesting tidbits in this passage that you might not pick up on if you're reading it in English translation, that actually kind of help to frame up the nature of the story a little bit for you and help to give you a sense of how the story fits in the surrounding passages and even sort of how the story means and how the story functions in the book of Genesis. So the first thing I'm going to say is in Genesis 22:1, the story starts, after these things, God tested Abraham. And that sentence, after these things, is important. It frames up the story in a pretty significant way because this story is not a standalone story. The story fits within like a big, long narrative about Abraham. And in a pretty significant way, this is kind of like the climax of the Abraham narrative. This is the big story that kind of caps off the Abraham narrative. And as we move out of this story, there's a little bit more Abraham stuff after the story, but we're really coming to the end of the Abraham section of Genesis. And then there'll be the short Isaac section. And then there's really the Jacob section and the Joseph section come after that. And so this bit where it says after these things is a way of connecting this story, Genesis 22, to the stories that precede it, because that lead up actually explains why this story happens. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit on Sunday, almost for sure. But just briefly, in the preceding chapters, God has already sort of set up a relationship with Abraham, a relationship that we call a covenant relationship. A covenant is, well, I mean, the only kind of covenants that are really covenants that we maintain still in our culture would be adoption would be sort of like a covenant, and marriage would be kind of like a covenant in our culture, where they are no less than a legal contract, but also substantially more than a legal contract. So it's not like a legal contract or only a legal contract. It's like a profoundly important relational kind of arrangement between two parties. And that conversation in Genesis between God and Abraham starts way back in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham isn't even named Abraham at that point. He's named Abram. And it continues at certain points down through the narrative until you get to Genesis 22, which is kind of the climax of that covenant story. And the thing that it's important to know about that story, the covenant story, is that God has been progressively making a covenant arrangement with Abraham. And the covenant isn't complicated. It's a promise to Abraham that God is going to bless his descendants. He's going to make his descendants great. In two different passages, God says at one point, more numerous than the sand in the seashore, and another passage, more numerous than the stars in the sky. So a lot, right? That's what that means. That God is going to bless Abraham with these many descendants, turn Abraham's family into a great nation, that God is going to give that nation the land that Abraham is living in, which is the region that we would now refer to as Israel. At the time, it was just sort of nomadic land, sort of probably the possession of various Canaanite tribes, maybe Egypt to a certain degree. And then the third portion of the promise is that God will, by means of Abraham, bless the surrounding nations of the world, bring them into covenant relationship with God as well. And we'll talk about all that stuff a little bit on Sunday. But the reason this matters is because as you move into Genesis 22, that relationship has been really up and down. It begins with like sort of a high point where God calls Abraham to take a big trip, and Abraham takes the big trip, and Abraham is very faithful. But it's got low points too, and especially it has low points related to the issue of whether or not Abraham's going to have a son. Because in the ancient world, progeny or descendants, your children, is really the hope for the future. And that's the hope for the future of the covenant, especially. And Abraham and his wife Sarah are very old at a certain point in the text, and they don't have children. And so they manufacture a way to have children by having Abraham have intercourse with his wife's maidservant, a woman named Hagar, which produces a child named Ishmael. And this is Abraham's attempt to kind of take control of the narrative. And God doesn't want Abraham to take control of the narrative, which is made pretty clear in those chapters of Genesis. And that is sort of what drives us into this part of the story, because eventually God does give Abraham a son by means of Sarah named Isaac. And this is the story of God kind of resetting the nature of his relationship with Abraham, based particularly on that attempt by Abraham to take control of the story, to take possession of the story. Which God is not particularly interested in having him do. So we sort of start there. That's one of the things that we should mention at the top. So the very, very first verse, it says that after these things, God tested Abraham. And he said to Abraham, and he said, "Here I am." Which again, there's a bunch of really kind of weird, interesting stuff in the Hebrew here. First of all, he tested Abraham. The word test here, which is Nisan in Hebrew, means, sorry, if I look off to the side, this is just, I have another screen there, and that's where my text is. The word Nisan means to test something like if you've ever played hockey and you're playing with a strange stick and you pick it up and you kind of just like get a feel for it and see how it bends, you're testing it in that sense. Or if you like are cooking in a kitchen for the first time and you take a new knife and you're checking the edge, that would be the same idea that we have here. So it's that the kind of thing you do with a tool you haven't used before that you're unsure about. And so it's this kind of interesting little bit where God is now, he has this tool, right? In both senses of the word. He's got this guy named Abraham, and he wants to see, is Abraham fit for this task? And so he's gonna check the edge on Abraham. Then the next thing that's interesting in this, that really doesn't come through in translation, is in verse 2, it says, God says, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac." But what really doesn't come through in translation is there's weird little tidbit in Hebrew that it's a word that doesn't translate into English. We don't ever translate it as translators, but it basically is the way that you make a request polite. It's sort of the Hebrew version of saying please. Which I'm not even entirely sure what to tell you about that. I'm not going to talk about that on Sunday, and I don't really necessarily know what to do with it. But God says something closer to, it's not so much a command, take your son, your only son whom you love. It is in commanding words, but it's almost like, please take your son, your only son, or it's like he's gentling it down or making it polite or making it, I don't know exactly what to do with that, but it's intriguing to watch God say, please. I'll say that. Verse 2 also mentions, take your son, your only son whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as, the Hebrew word here is olah. Olah is a burnt offering, or a whole burnt offering. This is would have been a well-understood idea, and most ancient Near Eastern cultures have a version of this. A whole burnt offering is an offering you give to the god that you do exactly what it sounds like. You burn the entire thing. And the reason you do this is to remove that, whatever it is, that animal usually, but sometimes also grain or something like that. You remove whatever that item is completely beyond your capacity to affect it ever again, right? You take it away from yourself and you give it to God. You give it entirely and totally to God. So this idea of sacrifice is a whole burnt offering. God is asking Well, he's asking exactly what it sounds like he's asking. He's asking Abraham to go and to kill his only son and to burn his only son completely to ash, which is quite horrifying to us. It's hard to say how horrifying it would be to Abraham. There were Canaanite cultures that participated in human sacrifice. We know that archaeologically. It is almost certain, well, we know from a couple of stories in the Old Testament that the Israelites themselves engage in human sacrifice. That probably was never a part of their official religion, the religion of worshiping God that we sort of understand from the Bible, but it's certainly something they did. And because we know they did it because there are commands not to do it, and you don't tell somebody not to do something that they've never done or never would do. And also because we have stories about it. We have this story, which, you know, is a story of somebody not sacrificing. But we also have, for example, the story of Jephthah in the book of Judges, where Jephthah does offer his daughter as a whole burnt offering to God, which almost all scholars see as a dramatic error on Jephthah's part, a really horrible mistake that he should not have done. But so how surprised would Abraham, how horrified would Abraham have been at this command? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. He doesn't react in a significant way, but this is an interesting thing about Hebrew narrative. Hebrew narrative is very sparse. It's very spare. It doesn't give you a lot of internal psychological detail. We're really used to that from our novels. The novel that we are really familiar with, like you pick up whatever, Lord of the Rings or something like that, and read it from front to back. And you get lots and lots and lots of internal dialogue. You get tons of detailed action. You get a real sense of the internal life of the characters. That's actually quite a recent invention in human history. Like it's only a couple hundred years old. And in the ancient world, nobody wrote like that. Nobody wrote like that. In fact, well, we might consider this relatively short chapter to be a really spare telling of such a complicated and nuanced and interesting story. This is actually, in its original context, this is a very long story. And it is as long or longer than most of the narratives you get in the Old Testament. A chapter is a long sort of vignette in an Old Testament narrative. There are longer ones, right? There are longer ones, but not that many of them. So this is a longish and relatively detailed one, but we don't get that internal emotional dialogue. So we don't really know how Abraham felt about this. Anyways, let's keep rolling along through a couple other interesting things. Verse 3, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And this is one of the interesting things here is that the word for the 2 servants that go with Abraham and the word for Isaac are the same word. When it talks about Isaac as a boy in various parts of the passage, that's the same word as this word for young men. We don't know, this word can be used for a relatively broad age span, but it doesn't mean little boy, and it doesn't mean full-grown adult. It could mean anybody from sort of their early teenage years down to what we would maybe consider early adulthood in their 20s or even in their mid-20s. So this is one of the really interesting things, and I will talk about this on Sunday. One of the really interesting questions about this passage, and the passage leaves this a little open-ended for us, but I have some thoughts, is how old is Isaac, and what does that do to the story and how the story functions? Because Isaac seems to be the same age as these 2 servants that Abraham brings along, and these servants are responsible for a lot, and that kind of suggests that Isaac is not a boy, right? That he's what we might consider to be a young man. At the very least, that's a viable, possible reading. Note also here in verse 3, look how long it's taking to get all of this work done. We're not moving really, really quickly. It doesn't go from God giving the command to Abraham being at Moriah. We have this detail about him rising early in the morning and getting his donkey and getting these young men and getting his son and cutting the wood and setting out and going to the place in the distance. This is good storytelling. We slow the story down, right? We want to slow the story down because we want to build tension. The author of Genesis is a good storyteller. The author of this story knows what he or she is doing. Where are we? Okay, Isaac the boy in verse 5, verse 6. Again, we're slowing the story down in verse 6. Slow, slow, slow. They're at Mount Moriah, but here Abraham takes the wood of the burnt offering and lays it on his son Isaac, and he himself takes the fire and he himself takes the knife, and then the two of them walk together, right? And all of this really is meant to sort of create the emotional reaction you're probably having, right? Whoa, walk together. It gives you sort of goosebumps that Abraham and his son are walking side by side. It's really focusing on their togetherness as they walk up the mountain for the sacrifice. Immediately before that, just after that, in verse 7, the next verse, it says that Isaac asks his father, "Where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" And again, I'm not exactly sure how much time I'm going to have for this on Sunday morning, but if you're interested in this story, there's a very, very famous book called Fear and Trembling by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard, in that book, it's not an easy read. It's a stiff reading, but it's quite beautiful, and it's an important work of European philosophy and theology. But in that book, at the beginning of it, Kierkegaard actually tells this part of the story. I think 4 or 5 times he does a little vignette where he fleshes out the details, because Kierkegaard is really interested in this. He's interested in what is Abraham doing here? Is Abraham lying? Right? Because Abraham says God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. What does Abraham mean by that? Does Abraham mean God is going to provide a different animal and not Isaac? Or does Abraham mean you, my son, are the lamb? Or is Abraham just lying to Isaac to make him feel comfortable so that he'll come along? Is he coercing Isaac? And Kierkegaard goes through these various possibilities, even the possibility that Abraham speaks with fury and rage towards his son to make his son hate him, so that it will not make his son hate God, so that his son will think it's him and not God who's doing this. It's a really interesting set of questions, because one of the problems with Genesis 22 that we struggle with as people now, and that we've always struggled with as people reading this text, is that God's command seems fundamentally unethical. Like, he's asking Abraham to sacrifice his own son, and that doesn't seem to be okay. It goes against our internal kind of moral compass, but also it violates most of what we know about the sacrificial system and the laws about the sacrificial system in the Old Testament. You're not allowed to sacrifice humans. It's against the rules. And Kierkegaard is interested in that, right? He's interested in that. And we certainly will talk a little bit, at least, about that. But that becomes a big crux. So if you're curious about that question, that issue of obedience and the ethical requirements of the story and how complicated that is, you might want to have a try at Kierkegaard. It's a difficult but rewarding text. Moving along. Oh, here's a fun one that I won't get to talk about, I don't think, is verse 8. Verse 8, Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked together. Oh, wait, is that the verse I want to note? I think it might be verse 7. It's before that. Sorry, I got the wrong verse in my notes. The sentence where Isaac says, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? This doesn't come through particularly clearly in English, but in Hebrew, that last sentence, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? The fire and the wood, where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Those different words are all sort of mirrored. And at the very center, the dead center of that sentence is the question, where? Which is meant to focus your attention as you're reading on that question. The author actually is pretty interested in driving you into this issue that Isaac is asking about. Where, Father, is the lamb? The fire is here, the wood is here. Where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And so the question where, the question that is almost directed to God, is actually at the center of that verse, but in a pretty meaningful way of the whole ethics of the story. What else can we talk about? Verses 7 to 9, there's more repetition of that together language, which is redundant, but it's redundant on purpose. It's to remind you of the togetherness of them. When you get to verse 9, we've had a lot of dialogue back and forth between Isaac and Abraham leading up to verse 9. There's no dialogue, which is really interesting, because that's the actual meat of the story. verses 9 and 10, where Abraham builds the altar, binds Isaac, places him on the altar, and takes the knife to kill him. They're not talking anymore. Isaac and Abraham have been talking up until that point. Why are they not talking now? Why is there nothing from Isaac voicing what's going on here? Which is something that I probably will get into a little bit on Sunday, because it's an interesting question, right? Why is that the case? Why have we silenced Isaac all of a sudden? All actions, right? No dialogue. Isaac doesn't object to the killing. And then the last thing I'm going to mention here from the details, I'll say a couple more things before I wrap up, but last thing I'm going to mention here from the details of the text is when God, first of all, when God intervenes, he doesn't intervene directly. He speaks to Abraham directly at the beginning of the narrative, and the end of the narrative, it's an angel that speaks to God. Anyways, the angel speaks to Abraham, or speaks to Abraham. The angel speaks to Abraham and says, don't kill him, and then gives him an alternative sacrifice. But the alternative sacrifice is not a lamb or a sheep, right? Back in verse 7, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. We don't get a lamb. In verse 13, Abraham looked up and he saw a ram. Those are two different words in Hebrew, se and ayil. That is curiosity. And you'll say, well, how can that be that big of a deal? No, but remember, this text is really, really carefully written and very, very detailed. It is interesting, actually. And we are going to come back and think about that a little bit, about Isaac and Abraham's dialogue about the lamb that is absent in the story, which is interesting. The last thing I'm going to say is, when we talk about this story on Sunday, what we're really going to end up talking about is we're going to talk about desire and possession and the notion of the submission of our will to God. And I can't hardly imagine anything that makes North American people more uncomfortable than the idea of the submission of the will. We very much like to think of ourselves as people of will, people of personal will and personal power, making choices for ourselves, not letting other people make choices for us. But there's a really meaningful sense in which that North American value is actually pretty strongly at odds with the traditional Christian thinking about the human will and the human will in relationship to God, and what it means to have our desire and our will focused appropriately and correctly. So we're going to talk a little bit about Abraham's misplaced will, misplaced desire, and we're going to talk about the things that we hold and the things that we withhold. And as we do that, we're going to actually take a sort of progressive journey through the story. We're going to talk about Abraham's will, and then we're going to talk about Isaac's will. And then we're going to make a jump that might not seem immediately intuitive to you, but we're going to do something that we call, if you care about the technical terms, that we call typological or spiritual exegesis. And we're going to jump from Isaac and talk about Jesus' will. And we're going to move from talking about the will of Christ to talking about my will and your will. And we're going to then loop back around and start at the beginning with Abraham again. At least I think that's what we're going to do, because I actually, like I said, haven't written this thing yet. So we'll find out. These things do what they do in the writing. But that's my intention on Thursday afternoon at least. Anyways, thanks for joining us, everybody. I don't know if that was longer or shorter than we usually do for these things. I think it was like 10 or 12 minutes. I think we're about on time. But I appreciate anybody who tuned in live, and I appreciate anybody who's watching this after the fact. And hopefully we get to see y'all on Sunday at church as well. Thanks very much. See everybody later.